Okay, we're recording. Go
Uh,
ahead, James.
yeah, like I was saying, we're going to be talking about alternatives, diving much deeper into that bucket, and also introducing a new concept that we're calling purity culture. Before we get into that, I want to take a moment to introduce the Eine Institute. Um, the Eine Institute builds community around new understandings or technologies that will bring about a more balanced and reciprocal world. That's what Eine means, the reciprocity in the language Quechua, which is spoken by the indigenous people of the Andes. And everything that we are working on is focused on how do we make big transformative changes in society. And we think that this conversation around movement ecology and how do different traditions of organizing and social change work together is crucial in bringing about this balance in our movements, allow us to make big changes. And we're the hosts of the webinar series, and we thank you for joining us.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name's Sophie, and I'm working on the Social Movement Ecology project with Eine, and I'm really excited to be here on our third webinar. So I'm going to just go through really quick how to use the webinar technology for the people who are joining us live right now. So if everybody could just locate your chat box really quick. On the control bar, you should see a thing that says chat. If you can just find that and open it up. And then I want everybody to experiment, try it out with the chat box by putting in 3 exclamation points. So if everybody can just confirm that they found the chat box with 3 exclamation points, awesome. Seeing all our friends here, great. So we want everyone to be speaking to everyone, so make sure that your chat is being sent to everyone rather than one person in the chat, unless you want to talk to someone behind our backs, that's fine too. But we want to use these 3 exclamation points as a resonating practice. So anytime that you hear an insight or have a light bulb moment or hear something or realize something that resonates with you, then you can type in 3 exclamation points. And as the people presenting, that really helps us get a sense of that people are into the material and which things are really standing out as major keys. And so we really encourage you all to participate. There are going to be a few exercises sort of in the mix, and we encourage you to participate when those come up. And we also encourage you to hold on to any questions and insights that you have and wait for when we prompt you to ask questions. And there will be periods when we prompt you to ask questions. So just hold on to those until we prompt them. So we're going to start off with a quick review. We are under the assumption that you have already gotten the framework for social movement ecology. So you should have already watched webinars 1 and 2, basic and advanced movement ecology. So you have an understanding of our framework and the language that we use and the metaphor of movement ecology. So just as a quick review, to get us back in the headspace, there are 3 different buckets that we name as the different approaches to social change. There's personal transformation, changing dominant institutions, and alternatives. So that's alternative cultures and institutions. And all of these different approaches have different theories of change, different organizational structures, different tactics, and different metrics. And we really want to be building and seeing an ecology that works together across all these approaches. And the last webinar, we broke down changing dominant institutions a little bit further into mass protest, structure, and insight game, which all also have their own traditions and their own theories of change. And last time, we also introduced this new concept of primary and secondary theory of change. And what this means is that a group or an organization or a movement might have a primary theory of change of, let's say, mass protest. There could be a secondary theory of change that's incorporated in. So a mass protest movement and structure movement like the civil rights movement might also do service provision or build alternatives like the freedom schools within the movement that help complement and help them change and fulfill their mission. So today we're going to be covering alternatives. We're going to dive deeper down into the theory of change of alternative cultures and institutions and talk a little bit more about the strategies that they have, some characteristics that they hold, and the tactics that they use. And as we take this deeper dive, we're going to provide a little bit of our analysis of how sometimes we think alternatives can function in healthy ways that are really ripe for collaboration with the ecology, and can also function in unhealthy ways or toxic ways that tend to break down relationships and cause conflict within the ecology. So that leads us into this discussion about conflicts and collaborations, how alternative institutions and changing dominant institutions can commonly come into conflict, and also how they have massive potential to collaborate and complement each other's roles in the ecology. So why are we doing this? We really think that this is the frontier of the transformative revolutionary change that we need. We're up against some pretty massive problems, and we need to find solutions that match the scale of those problems. And that takes all of these different groups and organizations and approaches working together. So how many of you feel like if we could move from the constant conflicts and sectarianism between groups on the left and instead move into healthy collaboration, that we could actually realize that kind of transformative change that we want to see? How many of you feel that? I definitely feel that way. Awesome, seeing lots of exclamation points. So to start us out, Paul's going to illustrate some of what we're going to be talking about today, about how alternatives and changing dominant institutions can interact through a movement that we all know and love. So take it away, Paul. Paul, you're on mute.
Oh my gosh. Okay, my name is Paul Engler, and I'm a trainer for INE. And I'm going to tell a story that frames some concepts about Occupy. So if everyone go, we're going back 2011. Going back 2011, September 17th, there is this great call to Occupy Wall Street by Adbusters, Micah White, other people make this call. I am a direct action trainer. I do a lot of nonviolence trainings, and I'm paying attention. And what I realize is there's not that many people that are actually interested in this call. Not the standard people are interested. A lot of people that show up to do the planning are countercultural people, anarchist people primarily. And Nathan Snyder writes this book called Thank You, Anarchist, because he really believes that the subculture of anarchist, which I believe at one point had some very healthy elements. These people wanted to embody the world of the revolution as they saw it, and the occupation was their opportunity to take space and to basically create a parallel democratic system. And at first, there wasn't that many people at the park. There wasn't that many people that launched Occupy. But when people started joining, it had a lot of healthy spaces where people could talk about the crisis of democracy that everyone was feeling, because we had this huge economic crisis where the economy collapsed because of Wall Street billionaires screwing all of us, and there was no accountability. That all of us were suffering because of these actions. And so this counterculture of people doing consensus decision making and the general assemblies and taking the space was a space for a lot of people to feel heard, and a lot of radical politics that didn't have an expression to have a place that was safe, that was secure. And then a few things happened. Really, there was this video that of a woman getting pepper sprayed by the police, and it was a horrifying video of this woman screaming in pain. And a lot of people saw that and started, coming to the park. And then there was this march where 800 people got arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge because the police basically did this really abusive action of arresting lots of people without notification and stuff. And this created a ripple effect. And all of a sudden there was a trigger event, and lots of people started joining Occupy Wall Street, and it became more than just this group of alternative people that was the base, and it became a mass protest movement. But there was this fight and tension between the theory of change of people who wanted it to be an alternative system, that they didn't care whether or not Occupy Wall Street really affected the political system. They just cared whether or not it was representing true alternative, that the processes of the General Assemblies, that the radical politics were expressed. And those people who were more process-oriented, more radical, and more alternative were a lot of times in conflict with the people who wanted it to be a mass protest movement. And this was a tension within Occupy during the whole time. And I joined Occupy on the first days when we were planning it, and in Los Angeles. And it was also a lot of countercultural people, but it had healthy elements of counterculture, because this counterculture wanted to include people and was really happy that people were joining. But as time went on, the tension between the people who had a primary theory of change as mass protests and those that had a primary theory around alternatives and they had a healthy expression of that where they can work together, became more and more extreme. The healthy alternatives turned into toxic alternatives, and a lot of the people in Occupy that were from this anarchist subculture, there were a lot of people that ended up becoming very paranoid of co-optation. They became really rigid about whether or not everyone was following the exactly the right processes. In Los Angeles, there were warring general assemblies because they felt one general assembly wasn't doing the correct process. So then there was a sectarian split, and there was a lot of the people that were joining them from the outside, like the labor movement or even sympathetic politicians, all these different support that most movements would be like, hallelujah, we have all this support in the public, was seen by a certain toxic element of the alternative, which were this anarchist element that believed that they were being co-opted, and there was this paranoia around it, and it became more and more toxic as time went on. And a lot of this toxic alternative element ended up alienating people, booing people at general assemblies, really having animosity towards the media, and really rejected in the public who was providing support, and started expressing itself in ways that were alienating the public. And as time went on, the occupation in Los Angeles, we could not even get the mainstream or even very popular progressive organizations that were fighting the same battle Occupy was fighting against the 1%, would not show up to the occupation because they felt alienated by it, by the process, by the rigidity, and by it became really, really more toxic anarchist call-out culture of so the union that I represented, Unite Here, they showed up and would get booed, and so it got more and more toxic. And then basically the only people that were left at the occupation in the later days were this toxic element, and it created tons of problems. And in the end, people just stopped showing up. So this story really encapsulates a lot of what we're going to be talking about, which is healthy alternatives, toxic alternatives, mass protest movements, primary theories of change, secondary theories of change, and how they interrelate. Next.
All right, sweet. So just to continue the review a little bit, we're going to talk just quickly review the theory of change and alternatives, which is really centered around building institutions to live out in the world the values and things, the world that we want to see in the future, live that world out in the here and now. You can hear that logic in quotes like Gandhi's "Be the change you wish to see," or the IWW's "Build the new world in the shell of the old," or the Panthers, happy 50th anniversary to the Panthers, by the way, and their slogan, "Survival pending revolution." And for the Panthers, building alternatives meant self-determination and ending the community's dependence on the state and market, thus increasing the power for the people to struggle for revolution. But when alternatives, stop trying to affect dominant institutions and sort of slide just into being the change we wish to see. It can also mean creating new countercultures, building up new culture and norms and ideas that are separate from the dominant culture and institutions, and that we must protect from those things. Pass it off back to you, Paul.
So when we're talking about the theory of change of alternatives, which is one piece of the social movement ecology, when we start diving into how do they embody this theory of change of building an alternative in the dominant institution, what we have to really orient to is that doing that is really effing hard. It's hard to create alternative because the dominant culture of consumer capitalism, the dominant institutions, which is market capitalism, post-consumer capitalism, is so effing powerful. How much people get paid, how much people are valued based on the market is so dominant and pervasive across the globe that it's hard to create any alternative economic institution without having to compete or to relate to the market. And you even go to indigenous cultures all over the globe, and you can talk to leaders. Joanna Macy has this amazing quote where she's talking about the Sarvodaya movement in Sri Lanka, who threw out their colonial imperialist bastards that had taken over Sri Lanka. And they said nowadays it's a harder struggle than overthrowing colonialism because cultural imperialism, the fact that capitalism is so good at getting people to buy into the values of consumerism. So you have now our children who before were so deeply embedded in our culture of Buddhism and deep family networks and a village culture are now susceptible. They want to wanting Nikes and Coca-Cola and coming to the United States and this mythology of what consumer capitalism can do. So within that system of propaganda, which includes Hollywood movies, marketing, we see thousands and thousands of images every single day that reinforces that the market can provide our needs, that the whole system works, that people are happy if they just buy in, and are perpetuating again and again the values of the dominant culture. And in that space, it's very hard to create alternatives. Everything gets co-opted or it gets homogenized into consumer capitalism. So if that's the truth, if we're swimming in this ocean that's super powerful of consumer capitalism, that is a very powerful imperialist cultural force that is converting people to its ways and its values. Alternatives have to think, how do we build autonomous safety from all these influences, all the culture, the dominant culture, and how do we create a space where we can innovate in the market without being in the market? How can we create our own way of doing things that's different, even though we live in a global capitalist system? So we're going to talk about healthy alternatives. So I made a distinction when I was talking about Occupy, that there was a healthy expression of creating an alternative that can create a good movement ecology and relate to lots of pieces in the ecology, and there's a toxic one. So right now we're really going to dive into the healthy alternatives. So right now, if we take a deeper dive, we know that's the theory of change, and we know that the primary obstacle is how do we create safe places and innovation in the ocean of consumer capitalism. What are the strategies to do that? How do we do that? And the way I talk about the strategy of healthy alternatives is it's kind of like a castle, a medieval castle. In the medieval days of Europe, where there was a lot of feudal lords that would fight with each other to survive. A village, a lot of times, was embedded in a structure that had villages and farms, and it had a castle where people could flee to protect itself against people who were trying to attack it. And a lot of times the marketplace was in the castle, and there was lots of exchanges from the village on the outside that grew the food and provided the nourishment and the resources that the castle needed to survive. But the castle was a safe place where people could survive against attack, and where they could make decisions about who enters the castle, who doesn't. And if they needed to, they can bring up the drawbridge. But most of the time, the castle had lots of people coming in and out. So the castle is a place where there's lots of boundaries. There's a moat, there's walls, but there's also bridges where people could come in and out and interchange between the outside and the inside of our culture, the alternative culture or the alternative institution. And in that metaphor, we think healthy alternatives do something that's very unique in alternatives, is they're constantly thinking about bonding and bridging. Bonding and bridging. Bonding and bridging, what that means is that it's thinking about how do we build integrity of values and of beliefs, of practices that are different than the mainstream. How do we hold what is the alternative for us? And bridging is about how do we recruit new people? How do we be in dialogue with other people? How do we do all these different things that allows us to be in communication with other people and not alienated from the public? And when you balance those two things, you get health, because your alternative can survive because it's being nourished like a castle. It's being nourished from the outside, but yet it still can protect it against the negative influences from the outside. So when we're talking about what are some of the strategies that they do, that healthy alternatives do, a lot of times they'll spend energy creating an integrity of beliefs, values, practices, and norms that are distinct from the dominant system. And it will define them explicitly and really have a way in which people can hold those against and in opposition to the dominant culture. It can protect the autonomy and sustain the parallel within the dominant institution. And it does that in a lot of ways. And it can measure not just holding and bonding through beliefs that get people to hold the alternative, but it can also measure that experience and expression of the group's norms, values, beliefs, and practices alongside its impact to the outside. And because of that, it allows for growth. It allows for new people to come in and for the alternative to grow. Sophie?
You want me to keep going beyond this? Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the characteristics of healthy alternatives. So the how do alternative cultures and institutions actually accomplish these strategies? How do they maintain that health and integrity as they try to build a new system and protect its autonomy and do that balancing act, like Paul said, of the balancing the priorities of the actual process and experience of building something new alongside its impact? So Paul talked about this balance between bonding and bridging, and some of the sort of characteristics that I outline of healthy alternatives might even at first glance seem sort of obvious, but especially later when we juxtapose these characteristics with how alternatives become unhealthy, it's going to become a lot clearer how important these are. So like Paul already said, sometimes alternatives are really responding to a vital need with the community, a need for safety and support. So providing these spaces is important, especially when they might not exist within the dominant institutions or culture. Healthy alternatives are often also giving a common language to develop a vocabulary to explain their beliefs and values and practices that are going outside of the norm. And this helps them bond and create integrity of ideas. And they also start to create strong rituals and rules that strengthen the integrity. So this is really important, especially when an alternative concept or culture tries to decentralize, or if other people beyond the original founders, let's say, start to pick up on the ideas and try to adopt them. So if you think about things like alternative agriculture, certain things like organic or fair trade have very explicit understandings of ways to grow food that's not exploitative to the environment or exploitative to people on the land. So providing principles that set boundaries and reflect values, especially explicitly, allows people to opt into the culture. So also, whether you identify as a worker owner at a co-op, or you come from a religious domination that's developing an alternative institution, building a cohesive feeling of shared identity is super important for people to feel committed to the alternative and to see themselves as part of it and part of its longevity. So who has ever heard the phrase, the tyranny of structurelessness? Has anyone ever heard that phrase? Yes, a few people have. So just because an alternative might be trying to work against the systems of dominance and hierarchy that we see in our current institutions doesn't mean that it shouldn't have strong, transparent processes that everybody trying to enter in can either understand and trust or actually participate in some way. And it's really important for alternatives and the people within them to represent and fight for the values of their alternative. And healthy alternatives really want to wake people up to these new possibilities and ways of being that they're creating against what Paul said, this propaganda machine of the dominant system. So what that means is that an alternative can't isolate itself, right? So when an alternative is healthy, it's not constantly navel gazing. It actually wants to share its language and norms and rituals to outsiders who can potentially either see themselves in it and share the identity, or those whose needs might be met through it. So in a healthy alternative, people want to share this process and welcome new people in who agree with their principles. And they probably want to last a while. So they also invest in deepening the leadership of people who are already involved. So this is a participatory budgeting meeting in Brazil, which is also being experimented with in cities like New York right now, which is an alternative that's sort of nestled itself inside the dominant institution of government, but it's constantly soliciting participation because it rests on this value of democratizing budgeting. And who's ever seen a group that is constantly talking about democratizing power, democratizing this and democratizing that, but when new people try to join in and they don't know the language or have the right analysis, they end up being totally confused or ostracized. Has anyone ever seen that? I've definitely experienced that. And so it doesn't quite add up. You have to actually embody that democratization and welcome new people in, if that's what you stand for. So this goes along the same lines. This photo is of the National Congress in 2014 of the MST, which is the Landless Workers Movement in Brazil that is super huge, 30-something years old, like 2 million people strong. It's pretty incredible, and it has this highly complex organizational structure that starts at the smallest, like family level, at the base nucleus, up to the settlement, up to the state committees, all the way up to the National Congress. And they also have 9 different sectors. They've got human rights and education and youth and health. And all of those have their own collectives and levels of entry. And James was saying the other day how when he spent time learning from the MST, he was so shocked that the leadership was actually 3 generations deep. And so this photo is at the National Congress in 2014, and they opened it, you can see on the stage, by reenacting 30 years of MST history. So they have this fantastic sense of culture and history and shared identity, but they also have a million different points of entry into the movement and into the alternative communities that they're building. So the tactics of healthy alternatives really balance bonding and bridging. They're both expressive of the ideals of the community, and they try to embody the ideals, but they aren't so cryptic or obscure or without an attempt to be understood by the public. So people like John Lennon really embodied and came out of a hippie peace counterculture, but he demonstrated these values in a way that spoke to the hearts of those who were outside the culture. And therefore, in a lot of ways, he really infiltrated the mainstream culture and changed it.
So now we're going to talk about collaborations. How do healthy alternatives help all other organizations, movements, or other pieces on the pie? So if you look at other pieces on the pie, next slide, you can see that what we're talking about here is how does alternatives affect mass protest, structure, and inside game? And I want people to think of a time when alternative institutions or cultures have helped a movement, organization, or issue. Okay, you can either talk about a historical example or a personal example where you've seen that's very specific. And I want you to type it in, write it in right now, because we want to harvest everyone that's listening. We want to harvest their ideas. So please type it in. I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to tell a story, which is in the late 60s, early 70s, and going on even into the 80s, there was this amazing subculture, if you can go to the next slide, that was developed to create a safe place for LGBT people. And at this time, it's hard to imagine, but that gay bashing was very common, that people would get killed even for having the identity of being gay. And it was common that police officers would beat up and inflict violence against LGBT people. So there was this effort for LGBT people who a lot of times were kicked out of their families, kicked out of their house, fired from their jobs if they came out of the closet, to congregate in places where they could be safe and express their identity. And there were some of the first adopters of really all these beliefs about what it would mean if everyone could be open about being gay or challenging gender norms, challenging norms around sexuality. And a lot of this happened around bars, LGBT-friendly bars, and in certain areas, in certain neighborhoods, there was this geographic space of really of a lot of gay people and LGBT people getting together. And one of them was Castro Street in San Francisco, where a lot of people congregated. And they created lots of different alternative institutions. Harvey Milk, who went to Castro Street as a gay man, an openly gay man, formed an alternative business that was gay friendly, and it was a photography store. And all these places were a great haven for this alternative culture. But what he realized is that to have strength and to help other causes is that these people who were fighting against oppression were the first adopters of also understanding civil rights issues, understanding issues around labor, being in solidarity with people who were fighting against the war in Vietnam. And so Harvey Milk became this huge figure, bridge figure, and organized LGBT people to support a huge labor struggle that was happening at the time. Of workers were fighting against an abusive employer that was bottling beer, Coors beer, and he got the gay bars in Castor Street to actually pour out Coors beer in support of the boycott, and it was a huge success in encouraging the boycott. And because of that, the labor movement became very supportive in a lot of ways, or at least certain sections of the labor movement was very supportive of Harvey Milk when he ran for public. And then when he did so many things, even though he failed, and the issues of being LGBT friendly and having rights for LGBT people was very unpopular in the time, he did a lot to try to translate and win over the public to the movement. He ran like 3 times before he actually won a political position, and then he became the first openly public political candidate in San Francisco, in California, and some people even claim the country. So we can see that there's so many things that we can see in this example of what made alternatives healthy to the ecosystem. If you can go next. So what is a time when alternative institutions and cultures have helped your movement organization issues? And from James, he says, there was a hip hop subculture that politicized me and always helps the movement grow. Just a couple of weeks ago, I helped organize a concert where the police killed a 13-year-old Tyree King to help the community heal and come together to take action. The artists who performed all donated their time, and it was dope. So we can see there that the example James is using is there's an alternative culture that has a lot of the aspects that we're talking about with healthy alternatives that is supporting the movement. So when we did research, we gathered what we thought were some of the most common characteristics of how healthy alternatives can help the whole movement ecology. And we organized them into different categories, and we picked what we thought were the best examples to explain all the unique way in which that could be expressed. So if we go to down, so if you look at Harvey Milk, you could see that the alternative institution and countercultures created a base of support for an issue that was not popular, LGBT civil rights, in the face of the mainstream public. And so a lot of times alternative institutions are the first ones that are able to take that issue before it becomes a mass protest movement. And you see that with Harvey Milk and with Castor Street. All those alternatives created the critical mass before really a mass protest movement could break out. Next. So you see throughout history, alternative communities were the early adopters and often started the first trigger events of a movement. So for instance, Quakers come from the Anabaptist tradition. They were persecuted in Europe. They came to the United States. They had a lot of radical pacifist beliefs. They had a lot of egalitarian beliefs. Quakers, some Quakers run their meetings in a totally consensus, non-hierarchical way. And for 200 years in the United States of America, the Quakers were a lot of times the first people to join on a lot of different social justice struggles. Same thing can be said around the Black church or the Black liberation struggle. A lot of times, freed slaves and the communities that were formed in American history were the first adapters for a lot of movements. The anti-abolitionist movement to the women's suffrage movement were populated by these countercultural people that first experimented with these beliefs within their community, and then became the leaders, the first leaders of the mass protest movement when it broke out. Seneca Falls, which is considered to be historically to be like the birthplace of the women's suffrage movement, was populated by Quakers, and that's because the alternatives creates this depth and the ability for people to experiment and then take those beliefs, and when they sometimes can do an event that captures people, and we call those trigger events, that creates a movement. So, in the example of Occupy, it was a lot of countercultural people, but they had trigger events that then were able to bring in a lot of people that were more mass protest oriented, and they were able to bridge and be the first adapters that created mass protest movements. In the picture, we have the Clamshell Alliance. A lot of the first people that developed the Clamshell Alliance, which was the movement to stop nuclear power plants. They were very successful, but the first trigger event and the beginning of what many people see as the movement against nuclear power happened from hippies and countercultural people getting arrested in a way that sparked interest and created a mass popular movement. If you also go down, alternatives create experimentation and new possibilities to advocate for, okay? So, for instance, a lot of times mass protest movements or the inside game or structure have a hard time conceptualizing radical changes. They're just trying to figure out what they can win within the political weather, or a little bit of what they can change that is very doable, that they can conceptualize by changing the political weather. Mass protests do that, but alternatives can create viable options that then can be advocated for. For instance, organic agriculture, alternative agriculture, has experimented and found new ways to produce food that doesn't use fossil fuels or uses all these alternative methodologies. And now because of that, there can be a popular movement, and the environmental movement can advocate for these alternatives that would have never been explored or understood if we didn't have the alternatives that were really showing the viability that then could be scaled or used to push for reform in the dominant institutions. We can now push for new ways of not destroying the environment through industrial agriculture because we have those models. And another thing is restorative justice has created a lot of models that allow us to advocate for more radical and really viable alternatives to the horrible system of criminal justice in the United States. Restorative justice has a lot of little models that have been experimented with, which actually solve some of the same problems that people have within the mainstream and the dominant culture with criminal justice. But now we can do that in ways, and we could say it really works, and it could be a part of a mass movement advocacy and demands. The next major category of how alternatives can help the movement healthy, and what I'm saying, this is a lot of times specifically around healthy alternatives, is that alternative communities can be the shock troops of a mass protest movement. So in the Indian independence movement, where Gandhi was one of the most prominent leaders by far, there was an alternative wing of the movement called the constructive program. And one of the major things that the alternative wing of the movement did was create what's called khadi cloth, or homespun cloth. And because the British imperial bastards would create industrial cloth and destroy the market for villages to create their own cloth. So there was a boycott on the exploitation of the Indians for creating British cloth, and it became the uniform of the movement to wear homespun cloth. And there was a whole institution that at its height, it had 300,000 weavers and spinners that would make this homespun cloth, and was sustained by the movement in some ways. And I'm doing an article right now for Waging Nonviolence, and I'm doing research on this and looking at all the stats and statistics of how they maintain this amazing alternative infrastructure within the movement to sustain these people that were weavers and collectives, weavers and spinners. And during certain years, they did not have any records of what was happening with the Spinners Collective, because all the bureaucrats, all the people that were running the Spinners Collective got arrested in the mass protest movement when Gandhi declared, and when the Indian National Congress declared Satyagraha, or the mass protest movement against the British Empire. They became the shock troops. Tens of thousands of people who were spinners then became got arrested. And India had a massive amounts of people get arrested and not cooperate, partly because the alternative institutions were the shock troops of the mass protest movement. So think of a time when your movement has been helped by the countercultural alternative institution. If you want to write down anything, Sean here said, radical visual artists building alternative narratives, integrating movement messages into their work, and sometimes even becoming a protest movement of their own. Cultural workers going on strike at MoMA against the war, or Liberate Tat, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, pushing cultural institutions to drop fossil fuel industry sponsorship. Great example, great example. Okay. So I want to think of a time when your movement has helped countercultures or alternative institutions. So this is a little different exercise. We're going to harvest now. If anybody can put in, what were times that not that the alternatives helped them, but that they helped the alternatives. So mass protest movements, structure, or the inside game helped alternatives. When have we seen that? When have we seen that relationship happen? And the story we use a lot is, if you go on to the next slide, is the MST. So the MST is an amazing movement because it has all these cooperatives, all these different alternative agricultural system in Brazil, with thousands and thousands of farmers with their own land or collective land, are actually part of a movement, and that movement fights for political power. And because they have political power, they do things to help the organic farms and the collectively run cooperatives and farms. And because of that, they're able to get the government to give them resources to do schools, or to pass regulations so that they can actually take over land that is not used or owned by these very rich landowners. They can occupy land. So the fact that the alternatives exist is partly because of the space that the mass protest wing of the movement and the political wing of the movement is able to give the alternatives. And we see that the level of them being able to scale and have political power is it really does influence how big they can get and how amazing their movement is. So that's an example of the fact that the mass protest or political movement was able to help the alternative farms in the MST. What is a time when your movement or organization has helped the counterculture or alternative institutions? So James has an example. Charter schools are getting public money. Ew, we do not like that. So the right wing is getting help from their private alternatives from public institutions. So in some ways, what James is talking about is that even though we don't like them, alternatives happen on the right too. We have crazy right-wing evangelical groups that are super conservative that do homeschooling and stuff, and they can lobby to get resources, public resources for their alternative, especially if they take over charters. They might not be explicitly evangelical, but they can get right-wing sort of the Walmart Foundation can support charters that back up privatization of education. So we can see how they can create alternatives but the same way we can. Okay, so I'm going to give a couple more examples. This is through our research. We've been collecting a lot of examples of what we see as the major categories in which the mass protest structure and inside game is able to support the alternative institutions. And like we said with the MST, changing the dominant institutions to make space for the alternatives through laws, regulations, resource, and education. And when it comes to the MST, they get a lot of support through basically public education. They take over schools and they train the teachers, and because of that, it really supports both the alternative schooling and education system that the movement believes in, but also the alternative cooperative agricultural system. We also see in the movements radicalize people to join and create alternatives. Okay, so in the 60s, there was a flourishing of countercultures that exploded in the late 60s and early 70s. And a lot of that happened, sociologists and social movement historians show that the reason a lot of that happened was because mass protest movements changed the political weather and allowed people to really challenge the dominant culture and radicalize people. And because of that radicalization, there was people dropped out, or they were more uncomfortable just agreeing to being part of the dominant system. And there was a hippie counterculture, there was a Black liberation movement, and a lot of the people that formed that and were recruited into that were first started through the popular civil rights movement or the popular movements of the anti-war movement. So I want to hand it back to Sophie to take any questions or insights.
So we just want to take a pause here. We just downloaded a lot of material and see if anybody has any questions or any insights that they want to highlight, some major keys that they heard, or some reflections that they have about what healthy alternatives look like and their different strategies and characteristics, and also how they can collaborate with the rest of the ecology and how the rest of the ecology can collaborate with healthy alternatives. Are there any pressing questions? Okay, if not, I'm going to move on. But if more come up later, we're going to have another period for questions. So just hold on to them, write them down, and get them ready for that. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about what we see as unhealthy dynamics within alternative institutions and cultures. And we're going to use a particular language that we think helps describe these dynamics that are not of alternatives that are not in a balanced state. So we call this purity culture. And we define purity culture as a relatively small group of people that express strong values, beliefs, and practices that are often regarded by the public as strange, unclear, or dogmatic. Purity cultures are isolated from and constantly defending themselves against the dominant culture and the public. So some key words in this definition are things like dogmatic, isolation, and defense. And we obviously this is a spectrum. So in order to kind of elucidate the different choices that we see alternatives having to keep themselves either in relationship with the ecology or breaking down relationships in the ecology, we're describing purity culture as the most toxic sectarian elements of alternatives. So what purity culture really is bonding without bridging. So the bonding elements of the alternative end up becoming more weighted than the bridging elements. So going back to the castle metaphor that Paul introduced earlier, unhealthy alternatives are like when a castle is under siege. So this is when the alternatives are feeling like the dominant culture is in full throttle attack on them. So they're trying to co-opt or destroy, the anti-capitalist sentiments within. So the alternative has to completely shut down, draw up the drawbridge, isolate itself, close off its walls. And sometimes these attacks, like we said earlier, are very real, and it's important for alternatives to have strategies to protect themselves. But a lot of times, possibly because of the trauma of the real sieges that happen, alternatives groups start to create imaginary sieges. So if you thought that the super rich king was outside your door all the time trying to bust in and destroy the beautiful democratically run society that you've built inside, you might also be a little bit paranoid. And it just sort of creates these dynamics like, screw it, I'm not putting down that bridge anymore. We're better off just expressing our values together where we're safe inside. But the trouble with that is that then the castle is completely cut off from the farms and the villages outside, the things that are providing nourishment and channels of innovation and interaction. And it ends up just killing the alternative, and the alternative ends up just rotting and dying from the inside because of this lack of relationship. And we also want to take note here that purity culture can arise as a secondary theory of change within other approaches. So just like a different approach might incorporate alternatives as a secondary theory of change, so let's say structure-based labor union might also include alternatives like service provision. Other theories of change can have purity culture arise within it. So we want to make note of that, because some of our examples, even the example of Occupy, may at some point have a dominant theory or a primary theory of change that is mass protests or changing dominant institutions, and still have an alternative purity culture that rises up within it or is a faction of it. Okay, James, take it away.
All right, cool. And at the beginning of this, when we were doing the review, Sophie talked about secondary theories of change. And so we wanted to take a second just to talk about how purity culture can arise as a secondary theory of change within other approaches, within mass protest, within structure, within personal transformation, and especially these toxic elements. And what are some of those strategies that purity cultures use to defend themselves? So we go to the next slide. This is really about creating walls, real and metaphorical walls. Some of the walls are helpful, of course, because we need to have clear boundaries over who is in our groups and leadership and whatnot. But in a society where, we're actually seeing the sort of the logical extreme of the wall building mentality run for president, I think we can see how this plays out even in our own cultures, in our own movements, when it gets into a more toxic, unhealthy alternative sense. And as the purity culture develops, we have to figure out, how do we protect the beliefs, the values, the practices from the dominant system, and keep the dominant culture out. Can you go to the next slide, please? And it's because we're trying to protect the purity of the group from threats and co-optation. And as Sophie said, in sort of the castle analogy, there are very real, legitimate reasons that our movements and our alternatives have to worry about co-optation, worry about infiltration. The legacy of COINTELPRO is just becoming now widespread knowledge, where we see how infiltration can destroy the work that we're doing. Also, this is an election year, so the threat of co-optation becomes very real and very prominent. And I'm sure we've all seen or experienced attempts with people running for office to co-opt our movements and the energy and the rhetoric of our movements. But we have to navigate through those murky waters, and we cannot let the purity of our groups become more important than bridging with others just because they might not share our specific cultures, norms, perspectives, especially if we want to have real external transformative impact. The bridging is important if we want to make a transformative change in society. Can you go to the next slide? Because groups that are stuck in purity culture actually begin to measure their success by the purity of their politics or their process, even giving more weight to the purity of the internal life of the group over the external impact. And a lot of this comes down to a question: if you think that this strategy will work to create the change that you want to see, do you think that transformative change will come from a small group of people finding the light, finding the right answer and building an organization to go and proselytize or go and convert the masses? Or is it going to come from the masses of people struggling around their interests, around their self issues, and developing ideas and culture that meets the level of struggle and the stage that they're at? So some of these things we begin to see in the strategies of unhealthy alternatives. Next slide. I think that's Paul.
So one of the things that you can really tell between an unhealthy and a healthy alternatives is that a lot of times healthy alternatives understand that they are not going to be the one that changes the dominant institutions. They understand that they are part of a movement ecology, and they understand what they can and cannot do, and that they might be okay being a little isolated, but they're not going to enforce their beliefs and norms on a mass protest movement. Or in some ways they can appreciate that there's different spaces and there's different people in the movement ecology. Unhealthy alternatives, which we call purity culture, does not do that. And one of the reasons they don't do that is because people who have purity culture a lot of times have what we call the myth of the righteous few. What is the myth of the righteous few? It believes that if we're just pure, we're just more revolutionary, if we're the vanguard, if we're if we have the right politics, the right anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and intersectional analysis, if all we do is we're perfect in our political beliefs, that in itself will create the change we see because everyone will jump on board. There's a lot of different mythologies and narratives about how being a pure group can transform the world. And this is embedded even in religions and Christianity and a lot of extremist cults, is that they have this belief. Sometimes it's even fantasy, like the aliens are going to come down, or there is, the spirit is going to be revived if we just are the right people, the second coming is going to come. But these narratives happen in a lot of different ways in these very unhealthy purity cultures. And Jonathan Matthew has this, Matthew Smucker, who talks about this a lot, has this really great quote. He says, "I take no solace in this prospect of history, listing me among the righteous few who denounced the captain of a ship that sank." So the myth of the righteous few is something we have to look for, and that is a signal about an unhealthy alternative relating in really bad ways with the rest of the ecology.
All right, sweet. So let's talk a little bit more about some specific characteristics of unhealthy alternatives and purity culture. We often see the groups operating in isolated spaces, whether that be geographically isolated, maybe even like secret meetings, or just culturally isolated. I know I've had a lot of experiences getting active in organizing, movement building, and myself sort of isolating from friends, that I haven't talked to as much, that I don't see as much, that, actually do care very much about the things that are going on. I just actually haven't invited them into some of the things. I've been realizing as I've been talking to some of them, they see what's going on social media, but they didn't necessarily feel welcome into the spaces that I was creating and that I was a part of. And so that's something that I've had to recognize. If we go to the next slide. We've talked a little bit also about how alternatives are often process-oriented. Unhealthy alternatives and groups operating in purity culture take process to such a degree that it becomes actually alienating to the masses. And it's it's important to make sure that we're creating process and leadership, decision making that's less oppressive and hierarchical, and we're addressing these things inside of our groups. But sometimes we actually end up recreating different hierarchies and different sets of oppression when we do this. And we have such strong rules or rituals, even like the types of clothes people wear, the language and vocabulary that's often alienating to people. And a lot of this leads into, can we go to the next slide? Something that we call radical signaling, which reinforces who is in and who is out. You know, if they'd only told me we were going to wear Batman today, I would have felt it, but I didn't know. And radical, it makes it easy to see who's in and who's out of a group, often through unspoken, implicit rules and norms. And this oftentimes forces newcomers to act like they already know how to belong in your group, in ways that limit their ability to ask questions and learn, ways that inhibit everyone's ability actually to learn. And if our groups aren't creating spaces where people feel like they can learn, then people will leave. And stuff is complex because there's often race, class, gendered, structures that lead into who has access to different knowledge and different experiences, and who already knows how to operate in these types of spaces. And another characteristic, we go to the next slide, is call out culture, which all of us have I'm sure had some experience with, particularly we participated in. It's not always bad to call people out, but there's a growing conversation about how do we have a call in culture rather than a call out culture, which to me shows that there's a lot of people noticing the same thing that we are when we see that there are people in our groups and our movements who are essentially shamed into silence or out of the movement because sometimes they might not agree with certain things or know, as we're talking about how to be in or out of the group, and ultimately when we stop taking time to educate people, we're failing to grow our movements, and this especially impacts on people who haven't been in university settings and been privy to some of the language that we so often take for granted. And so now we're going to go to an exercise that Paul's going to lead us through.
So one of the aspects that we talk about with purity culture and unhealthy alternatives is tactics. And when we're talk about tactics from purity culture is, if you go to the next slide, tactics that express a belief or purity of beliefs but are alienating to the public, okay? So that is a sign of purity culture, and we want to ask you, have you ever been in an action where there was a very expressive of radical values or beliefs but did not communicate to the public or decision maker? When have you experienced it? If you can list and type in examples of actions that you've seen that. And I'm going to go to the next slide. I'm going to tell you, when I was part of Occupy, I was in Occupy LA, very active and camping out there some days. And I was also going around and meeting other people in different occupations. Des Moines, Iowa is where I'm from. So there was Occupy Des Moines, Occupy Chicago. I even went to the East Coast and saw some occupations there. And I was trying to gather, because I'm sort of a geek when it comes to movement, all the common problems that were happening. And one of the major common problems was problems with drum circles, countercultural drum circles, of people doing drum circles all night long, and even in a very interruptive way of general assemblies, and to the exclusion of everything else. And there were people who a lot of times had a countercultural value that I have the right to express myself. This is the culture that I want to embody. They were doing all this crazy drumming, but lots of people felt alienated, and the way they did it was alienated to neighbors who a lot of times complain at occupations because they're really loud because people were drumming all night and all day. A lot of times this is from a counterculture that is valuing the expression of this purity that I get to be able to do whatever I want, this liberatory individualism, but they're not calculating how that influences the public and other members who might be alienated by it. It's a good example of what we said in the exercise. We go to the next thing. When have you been in action that expressed radical beliefs but did not communicate to the public or decision maker? Any other examples for people? Well, keep on thinking and type them in if you have any examples. One example that Sophie has is vegan activists yelling at Whole Foods. Their meat is murder. Is it very communicative to the public? Is it getting people to join your movement or nourishing your movement? A lot of times it's an expression. That's an expression of being a militant vegan, not of being bridging to the public. Good. I've seen that a lot with the countercultures in the right around Christian right-wing evangelicals yelling at people on bullhorns at like public transit stops. Another good example. It's very alienating to the public and not very, very healthy to the counterculture. Okay. So next, what are conflicts from purity culture and unhealthy alternatives? How has alternatives hurt mass protest structure or the inside game? Okay, first, we have gathered from our research what we think are the major categories that we've seen break out in movement after movement of how purity culture has really affected things. And the first one I'll talk about is nonviolent discipline. In mass protest movements that are trying to change the weather, in momentum theory, active popular support, both passive and active popular support, is essential for movements to win. That's how the movements change the political weather to win any issue, okay? When I was part of the global justice movement, we were winning the public over understanding the negative effects of corporate globalization and quote unquote free trade, okay? But we had people that were coming from a counterculture that believed in violence and property destruction and did not believe in being accountable to the movement in itself. And this is an anarchist subculture, different types of anarchist subcultures that really advocated for this. It wasn't all anarchists, but it was a purity culture within it that was very isolated. And they, at one point, even during some actions I was part of, they advocated throwing Molotov cocktails, and it really affected us within the eyes of the public. It really sucked a lot of momentum out of our movement. And when we lost nonviolent discipline, it wasn't people who were thinking about bridging to the public or winning the public in our mass protest movement. Violence is one of the key factors you see time and time again, whether it's the United Farm Workers or Gandhi's Indian independence movement, or even the movement of the civil rights movement in the early 60s. Expressions of violence that alienate the public from the movement is one of the biggest challenges that is talked about again and again and again through the history of social movements. So much so that Gandhi and Cesar Chavez went on hunger strike or fast against their own movement because they realized that was the biggest challenge that he faced in escalating and creating a popular movement, was fighting against these purity culture that advocated for different beliefs that were expressive but did not care about the different theories of change and the different elements of the social movement ecology. Next. James?
There's also a problem, conflicts that arise around messaging. A lot of times, purity groups operating out of a purity culture mindset come to things and their messaging is actually very alienating. This is a picture of an activist with the Revolutionary Communist Party, RevCom, long live VA. And, throughout 2014, 2015, I saw a lot of RevCom activists. Sometimes, they were great, but they led to a lot of conflicts in different places as they would show up and have big banners and passing out their papers and different things. And the messaging that they were talking about was oftentimes not in line with the messaging that the community had. And ultimately alienated the community from joining RevCom, and maybe they recruited a few people. My guess is they earned more enemies than friends through those activities and the conflicts that ensued around their messaging and the communities. That's just one example. I'm sure y'all could think of a lot.
So another thing that we realize constantly comes up with purity culture in relation to social movements, the inside game, and structure-based organizing is the fear of co-optation alienates unions, established groups, sympathetic politicians, and celebrities. And I saw this constantly in Occupy, is that new people would come in, new groups who have been fighting the 1%, have been fighting for economic equality in our country for a long time. There was community groups that were fighting for tenants against banks. There was unions who, Unite Here, who was fighting against rich hotel owners, and were having a struggle in the same city as Occupy LA. They would come to support the occupation and ask for solidarity from the 99% against the 1%, which is the message of Occupy. And people would sometimes boo them. They would block them from participating, or even tell them you're not welcome here. In so many different ways, they would signal that you're not welcome here because they were scared that the union was going to co-opt the movement. And in a lot of cases, it was exactly the opposite. The union wanted to support the movement and create an opportunity for the movement to be invested in local struggles that demonstrated the messaging of Occupy Wall Street.
And we also see the fear of co-optation alienating movements, or alienating the media. I don't know, fuck Geraldo Rivera, but I've been a lot of actions, where people are just, the camera show, people's like, fuck you, get out of here. And it's true, the media is very much, corporate owned. There's lots of issues, lots of contradictions. But it's actually very possible, to steer. In my experience, journalists are more than happy to copy and paste what you send them and, repeat almost verbatim, different talking points, just out of pure laziness and the amount of work they have to do. So, it's one of these things that sometimes fearing the co-optation, it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy, as the media doesn't have anybody to talk to, and they end up painting the movement in ways that aren't favorable, or the actions in a way that they weren't intended to be portrayed.
James, you want to take this?
Oh, okay. This is me. Gotcha. So we just wanted to take a pause for a second to harvest any questions, any insights. We are nearing the end of this webinar. We have one more section that is going to be very juicy, I think. But we wanted to just take a second to see if there's anything that we need to go back over, any key insights that are really, I haven't seen too many exclamation marks in the last couple minutes, so I don't know, maybe there weren't too many, but just wanted to take a pause for the cause. And seeing nothing coming on the chat box, I'm going to continue forward. All right, sweet. So can you go to the next slide, please? So in this last section, we want to talk a little bit about why is it that we have so much purity culture in the U.S. today. And really, the point of this section is, just to talk about how, some of these developments owe their origins to historical and structural considerations and contradictions. So can we go to the next slide? And really, we sort of pin this down into three, I'm going to dive a little deeper into each of these, three major answers, three driving forces of some of this. One is just the structure of the U.S. electoral system. Another is this pessimism that we're noticing permeate the left, that we actually can't transform the dominant institutions of society. We want to talk a little bit about that. And then third is increased individualization in our society, and really the deepening of capitalist social relationships. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of the U.S. political system, because there's a reason it's different here. Our republic, our democracy, whatever, is different than in a lot of other parts of the world. One of the couple major differences are that we have winner-take-all elections, and we have lots of money in our politics, and especially with the Citizens United decision. These things really change the way electoral politics is done here. Since we have winner-take-all elections, that means that if you were to run for office and win, your election, say you only got 40% of the vote, you actually didn't get a majority, but the vote was split through a couple other candidates, you would actually get 100% of the power. Whereas in proportional representation systems, like a lot of the democracies in Europe, Latin America, there's the ability for the left to struggle for state power through third parties, through alternative parties. Because if you win, let's just say 17% of the vote, you actually get that same share of power. And it allows for the left to struggle for state power in a way that we've actually been structurally kind of shut out. So our movements and our discourse really aren't represented in the major parties at all, as we all know. And a lot of people would argue that the Democratic Party is where left movements go to die. And so we have a long history of rejecting mainstream politics and struggling for state power, focusing on countercultures and working outside the system. For example, the anti-war movement in the U.S. was very much, mass protest, and the labor movement. In France, the anti-war movement that they had in relationship to the Algerian struggle for liberation, was led by major political parties with seats in parliament. And so there's just a difference in the type of struggles that we've gotten into here. Can you go to the next slide? And so, move from 1776, all the way to the end of the 20th century, and a lot of things have been shifting. There's this philosopher, theorist, Francis Fukuyama. At the time he wrote this book, this was coming out, he was working for the U.S. State Department. And at the end of the 20th century, we know that it was sort of the end of the Cold War, the end of the battle between the competing world systems of socialism and capitalism, meaning that now there's not really a world system that people are trying to construct to combat the hegemony of capitalism. The fall of the Soviet Union, the reversal of the Chinese Revolution, regardless of your sort of position on either of those situations, has had a tremendous impact on the left worldwide. Now, especially in the U.S., most activism focuses on winning reforms to mitigate the damage caused to specific groups, rather than trying to reorganize the whole structure of the world. And I think a lot of it comes to some of this stuff that Fukuyama was talking about in the sort of the pervasive pessimism that results. And he said, what we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution, and the universalization of Western liberal democracy is the final form of human government. And, I was born around the time that this stuff was coming out, so I'm happy to be a living proof that history has continued, and folks are still struggling to find a new form of human government. Like Paul said, Margaret Thatcher also was writing about there is no alternative. And throughout the 90s, neoliberalism rose to such a point of hegemony that I think many folks really felt that there was not going to be a chance to overcome capitalism. And I think that's still something that we struggle with right now. Is there's a lot of anti-capitalists, but there's not a lot of socialists or communists today, and there's not a lot of people who can say exactly what they're struggling for. And I think some of this is because we're not entirely confident we can overcome this Western liberal capitalist democracy. And I think it's really deep. And I think on a more popular level, if we go to the next slide, these narratives of the end of the world, the end of history show up in some of the doomsday narratives we hear all the time. Shows like The Walking Dead, there's so many zombie movies, narratives that have come out that I love. I've been in so many, I don't know how many conversations I've been in about when the zombie apocalypse comes, what is it that I have a better plan for that than I do for revolution right now, to be honest. I've had more conversations about the zombie apocalypse than about revolution. But it's not just zombie things. There's also all these movies about alien takeovers and natural disaster flicks. There's all this that combines to really create this very real subconscious thought that I think is shared, especially among a lot of millennials I talk to, that the world really might end in our lifetimes. And, would you really care about building strategies to transform the dominant institutions in society if this horde of zombies coming at you? I know I wouldn't. Paul says in the chat box, plus the scientists say the end of the world is coming. And that is super real, actually, potentially. But, what does that do to our imagination and our perspective in the strategies that we take? Because if the end of the world really is coming and we think that, everything's just going to fall apart, these dominant institutions will fall apart on their own, which I hear a lot about, or the end of the world is coming, then it makes more sense just to find a nice quiet place with the people I love and stock up on cans and ammunition. So it's been very interesting. And then, and so I think a lot of this combines, we go to the next slide, just to a general loss of faith in our ability to change dominant institutions. And, and like I said earlier, if you don't think that you can change the dominant, if you don't think we can really overcome capitalism or white supremacy or patriarchy, some of these things, it actually makes more sense just to build safer spaces where we can mitigate for the harm caused to the most marginalized in our society. And like, with a lot of the conversation on healthy alternatives and unhealthy alternatives, the question of, how are we orienting ourselves to creating big transformations and reorganizing society is really key. But we can't do it if we don't have faith we can do it. So if we go to the next slide. But there's also, one of the other major driving forces, just the hyper-individualization of the US. And there's supposed to be pictures here. I'm looking at pictures on my screen, but I don't see them here on yours, but that's fine. But there's a picture on the slide I'm looking at of Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, which is a book that talks about the loss of different civic institutions, cultural institutions, things like even just like bowling leagues and what block clubs. The block clubs in Cleveland used to be super lit. You know what I mean? It used to be super, super lit. There used to be, oh, there you go. Thanks, Paul. Or Sophie. Thanks, Sophie. Yeah. There used to be super, super lit. But those things, institutions we're losing them, and people aren't participating in churches as much as we used to, in block clubs and bowling leagues. There's much more hyper individualization going on in our society, and a lot of this, I think, is rooted in the deepening of capitalist social relationships. But as it happens, we see more and more subcultures develop, including a subculture around activists. I mean, the term activist is relatively new. And it's new also that it's become kind of cool to be an activist and people are wearing the swag, which is great. But one of the dangers, especially with the rise of social media, which ironically makes it possible for us to talk to everybody in the world while also talking to ourselves in echo chambers all day, is that we actually become a subculture that is too self-referential, that is too self-contained, and that we're not bridging and working across all these cultures, all these different constituencies in our society to build the types of movements and the types of alternatives that we need to. And so these things, the structure of the US government, which is very real. I think we're going to have to get to a point where we rewrite the Constitution. The end of history and the pessimism on the left, these zombie movies and just all this doomsday stuff, and the hyper individualization of our society, I think, are some of the driving forces behind the purity culture and the toxicity that we find. And some of the ways I think to combat it are by doing something about the pessimism. How do we come together to really create strategies to bond our groups, have strong internal integrity, but also bridge and build the types of movements that we need to reorganize the whole world. And with that, we're going to pause for some more questions, insights, and we're going to wrap up. We've reached the end of the webinar. So thank you all for bearing with us and listening to all this information. We're really excited to have you with us, and your feedback, your questions, what works, what doesn't is really important as we are trying to make this material as impactful, useful, accessible, and all that. So yes, we'll stop here just to, thank you so much. Thank you so much. But yeah, if there's any questions, insights, we'd love to harvest some of those right now. And if anyone else from the training team wants to say anything.
We've got one question from Trevor. What space is there for the analysis that names structures of oppression, imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, named by bell hooks, and bringing that into movement spaces? Is naming heteropatriarchy only for the activist subcultures? Anyone want to take that?
I can take that, and then maybe I'll hand it off to James. But I think that one of the things is it's okay for alternatives to hold a lot of ideals. Our culture is so oppressive that it's good to have a lot of that culture that is attacking white supremacy, sexism, racism, imperialism. However, what you see in healthy alternatives is an ability to acknowledge that we can create spaces like that, and those spaces are important in the movement ecology, but they're not everything. And we can't necessarily create spaces that are always pure in creating an alternative. There's spaces, mass protest spaces, inside game spaces, and external spaces, and that we have to balance that. It's okay to be able to bring some of the alternative, more healthy, liberatory culture into mass protest inside game and structure, but we have to balance it and understand that we're not going to always be in spaces that are totally pure. And so it's really the difference between a healthy expression of how we do anti-racist, anti-imperialist, anti-sexist, anti-spaces, how we do that politics within alternatives and within other spaces is different. We have to make cost-benefit analysis of how do we do this in a way that holds different theories of change, and how do we balance the bridging and bonding? How do we do that in a way that doesn't alienate people? But we really need the balance of alternatives holding some of those beliefs, and also being able to come into other spaces and lend that as a support in a way that can be a secondary theory of change for mass protest, or for the inside game, or for structure-based organizing. James, you want to also comment?
Yeah, I think that was cool. I'd like to add just a little bit, I think, because I think it's super important to craft these new ideas so that we can replace the old ones and have spaces that foster the development of those ideas. But I think strategically, everything has to be geared towards, transformative social change to have the type of impact that we need to really enact these ideas and enact these values in the world. We need to have power to do that. And so the danger is when we don't, when we kind of think that crafting the correct idea first before necessarily having the power to enact it is so important that we don't engage in the type of mass struggle that will generate movement, generate power. And also it kind of relies on us thinking that if we create this perfect idea, we can go out and then just teach people, we get the right vocabulary, the right tools. And I don't think that's, I'm somewhat of probably gave this away a little bit in some of my comments, a Marxist, and it's not a very materialist way of thinking about how change will work. That we'll go and we'll give people these new ideas before they actually, see and feel a need for them through the struggle that they've engaged in the work that they're doing. And there's just stories that I've heard also from some of our elders that give me faith that we can bring people who come from very different backgrounds and would reject an analysis like bell hooks, and actually bring them into struggle, and through the struggle find more points of solidarity and commonality to bridge that gap and come together. For example, one of this guy named Willie Baptist, who is a great organizer and movement educator. He was part of organizing the Kensington Welfare Society in Philly, and they did a lot of camps for encampments with the homeless community and won a lot of things and reforms that were very transformative for the homeless community in Philadelphia and across the country. And he told me this story about one time in one of these encampments, there was a man who used to be part of the KKK who came in, and there were, most of the camp was black and brown, and he had his daughter with him. And for weeks, he would not allow any of the people of color to come near his daughter, talk to his daughter, anything, but eventually through conversation, through education and dialogue, but also through the material work of just struggling around different issues, this former KKK member was in solidarity and working with former members of the Black Panthers and the Young Lords. And so, it was a story to me that was like, okay, maybe, what we have to be doing is figuring out how do we bond and create, strength and unity around these new philosophies, ideas, cultures that we want to see born in the world. But we really have to bridge with others. We really have to bridge with others so that we can bring them through to fruition through a process of struggle.
Somebody says, how do we address purity culture in our movement and organization in a way that allows for healing and growth? And just to comment a little bit about this is that one of the most important things in social movement ecology is that you understand your theory of change. You understand that you're an alternative, and that alternatives and alternative cultures are not designed to scale up. They're not designed to be a mass protest movement. So by being able to acknowledge what are the spaces and the different theories of change, we can manage a lot of these problems. We can teach people, okay, if you have purity culture, this space is not the right space to enact it. We want healthy alternatives in this space, but that can bridge with our movement and acknowledge what we need to get done, as well as our need to have a mass protest movement that wins over the public and can be in dialogue with that, rather than movements that are coming in and imposing their theory of change on the mass protest, on structure, on the inside game. So that's one thing, is that I think it's about really teaching people their theory of change and understanding how to be in good relationship with it. And also, when we talk about mass protest, or we talk in momentum, we talk about front loading and creating explicit decentralized principles that are collectively enforced so that people can have their own beliefs and their own spaces to do alternatives. But when they come into this space, they know explicitly what are the rules of how to represent your theory of change in a healthy way that makes it so that the primary theory of change of winning the public is prioritized, and can hold other theories of change, but that not in a way that's in conflict. Sophie?
Yeah, I think you said it great. I think like one thing that we constantly practice, or one of our practices, our tools in social movement ecology, is appreciation, and I think we can actually transform people who are trying to represent purity culture and rigidity by actually appreciating the special role that they could play in the ecology if they could be healthy alternatives, and actually appreciate them for what they're bringing to the table, which may actually be some really great ideas, some good analysis, some practices for a new alternative society, and good intentions for wanting to build and create that in a safe, innovative community. And being able to appreciate those strengths of what people coming from alternatives, even when they're representing the toxic elements, can instead transform them towards healthier behavior. So I think that's a practice that we're constantly trying to use to put people in relationship. It's not to just intellectually understand what theories of change you have, because that kind of gets you caught up in your head, but going more into the appreciating from the heart of what each of us has to offer is super important, and can transform the way that people work together to be more collaborative.
Great.
So it doesn't look like we have any more questions unless either of you have anything else to add. If there's any last minute insights or questions.
I just want to say thank you so much for being part of this webinar, and I really look forward to you guys being involved in our INE community and our Momentum community and the community that we're building around healthy social mood ecology.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Bye.